rolling into Kabul. With the Taliban in retreat, U.S.-backed United Front forces seize the Afghan capital. Next challenge, restoring order. U.S. commandos step up the hunt for bin Laden. Why the Pentagon believes chances of finding him are improving. The mystery of Flight 587. Does this tail fin hold the key to the Airbus crash? And Eye on America. Two New York communities, worlds apart, touched by the same tragedy.
This is the CBS Evening News with Dan Rather reporting from CBS News headquarters in New York.
Good evening. Outrunning even the most optimistic predictions, forces of the anti-Taliban United Front rolled into Kabul today on the heels of fleeing Taliban troops. And CBS News has learned tonight that fighting has erupted in the heart of Taliban country, in what amounts to the Taliban soul city of Kandahar in the south. This is encouraging news for U.S. war planners, but there is deepening concern in Washington over Afghanistan's political future. Kabul, the Afghan capital, fell only 5 days into a United Front offensive that analysts had warned might be a drawn-out campaign of attrition against dug-in Taliban defenders. It leaves nearly all of northern Afghanistan now in United Front control, with Taliban fighters said to be streaming south toward their supposed stronghold of Kandahar. We have eyewitness reports on the fall of Kabul from two correspondents who are there tonight. But first, the overall story from CBS's Maureen Maher, also inside Afghanistan.
Soldiers of the United Front rode into Kabul on a wave of victory. A ragtag army marching into the promised land, cheered on by the people they had come to liberate.
People is very happy about this situation.
Crowds lined the streets to welcome them and to savor simple pleasures. The sound of music, forbidden under the Taliban, was once again heard on the streets of Kabul. Barbers opened for business, razors came out, and beards, required under Taliban law, came off. Women who've been undercover for the last 5 years shyly shed their veils. The United Front moved in at dawn, so quickly and so unexpectedly that, as this BBC reporter found out, the Americans were still bombing the capital. Much of the Taliban fled without fighting. Those who didn't leave quickly enough met the wrath of an angry population. And those who survived the citizens were hunted down by the United Front, captured, imprisoned, and are now facing an uncertain fate. The United Front claims it is in Kabul as a security force to maintain law and order, something badly needed in a town where everyone has a gun and a score to settle. The United Front says it has invited other Afghan factions to come to Kabul to negotiate a post-Taliban government. And it's also asked the United Nations to send in a peacekeeping force. Maureen Maher, CBS News, Hoja Bahauddin, Afghanistan.
Western correspondents have been rushing to Afghanistan's capital since the Taliban fled. We're going to get the latest eyewitness reports from Kabul tonight from two reporters who are there. British television correspondent and CBS News contributor Lara Logan was with a United Front commander as he entered the city in triumph. I asked her if the Taliban seemed to be making an orderly or disorderly retreat.
I think the first sign of an orderly retreat is when a retreating army takes most of its weapons and ammunition and artillery with it, certainly takes the tanks and the heavy guns. And if you can believe what the Northern Alliance are saying, the Taliban have hardly taken any weapons with them.
Did you see any Taliban soldiers, any defectors?
I saw many Taliban soldiers on the streets of Kabul, and earlier this morning when I crossed over the Taliban trenches, I saw hundreds of defectors there as well. The American airstrikes were significantly effective and definitely took their toll on the Taliban. Taliban soldiers said that when they heard the sound of the jets approaching, they used to run and hide in their underground tunnels and caves, and they were very afraid. They said to me, "We're only human." Of course, we were terrified.
I know from my own experience in Afghanistan, and I know from reports in recent days, that it's not uncommon for victorious soldiers to mutilate the bodies of those slain in combat and to loot the bodies. Did you see any of that?
I did see some bodies that appeared to have been looted. There are also reports in the capital, Kabul, of bodies of Taliban militia that were inside the square in a park, and some of them had money that was pushed into their head wounds and pushed up their nostrils.
The women, did you still see the women covered in Taliban fashion, or were they becoming uncovered, at least comparatively?
At first, I could only see men on the streets. There weren't very many women, but occasionally I started to see the blue flash as women in burqas, the traditional robes that they wear, which cover them from head to toe, as they walked by. And then finally, I saw one woman who lifted her burqa and shouted at me in Persian, "Look at me, look at me."
Laura Logan, thank you very much.
Thank you.
From a strictly military standpoint, of course, the fall of Kabul represents a major success in the U.S.-led war. But much remains to be done, including the central mission of finding and bringing to justice Osama bin Laden, as CBS's David Martin reports.
A small number of American troops is in Kabul tonight as the Taliban retreat has turned into a rout. Thousands of troops either have been killed, have defected, or been taken prisoner. Britain's Prime Minister Blair summed it up.
The military strategy aimed at defeating the Taliban is clearly succeeding. They are in disarray and retreat.
The Taliban has been forced to give up an enormous amount of territory to the opposition forces.
Last Friday, the Northern Alliance controlled less than 15% of Afghanistan, and today they have forces in about half of the country.
As the Taliban troops try to retreat, they are being hounded by American jets, although the chaos on the ground has forced some aircraft to return to their carriers without dropping their weapons.
The trick is trying to differentiate between Taliban and other forces and other peoples that may be leaving those locations. And that's very, very difficult.
Teams of American commandos are now on the ground in southern Afghanistan hunting for Osama bin Laden. And Secretary Rumsfeld thinks the chances of finding him are going up.
To the extent that there are more opponents of the Al-Qaeda and Taliban in more parts of the country, one would think more information will ultimately become available.
The U.S. wants to move food piled up in Uzbekistan into Afghanistan by opening up airfields at Mazar-e-Sharif and Kabul, an operation that would be carried out by an international force, including troops from Muslim countries. An international force is also urgently needed to keep Kabul from descending any further into chaos.
I believe that we can, therefore, make real progress towards the filling of the current power vacuum in Kabul, but we need a UN presence there as soon as possible.
And one more sign, the Taliban is rapidly losing its grip on power. Fighting has broken out in the Taliban stronghold of Kandahar, and local tribesmen may actually have taken the airfield away from the Taliban. Dan?
David Martin reporting live at the Pentagon. Afghanistan was high on a full agenda today at the White House, where President Bush hosted visiting Russian President Vladimir Putin. Correspondent John Roberts has our report on that tonight.
The United Front ignored a weekend plea from President Bush to stay out of Kabul, but Mr. Bush declared today the alliance knows it cannot occupy the Afghan capital.
They must recognize that a future government must include representatives from all of Afghanistan.
Beginning a three-day summit with Russian President Vladimir Putin, Mr. Bush did indicate concern about troubling reports that the United Front was committing atrocities against the enemy, including these photographs showing rebels executing Taliban POWs.
We will continue to work with our Northern Alliance, with the Northern Alliance commanders to make sure they respect the human rights of the people that they're liberating.
Both leaders today pledged to keep up the pressure on bin Laden and to work together to reduce the threat of biological, chemical, and nuclear weapons falling into the hands of terrorists. Outlining a new strategic relationship with Russia, President Bush announced he would cut America's long-range nuclear arsenal by 2/3. Putin said he would try to respond in kind, a move that could also reduce the threat of so-called loose nukes, says former Assistant Secretary of State Carl Linderfirth.
The security of Russia's nuclear weapons and material is directly linked to the United States' national security. If those things fall in the wrong hands, we are at risk.
The cuts to the U.S. arsenal are an enticement to Putin to sign on to the president's plans for missile defense. They will continue those discussions at the president's ranch in Texas, though we are told not to expect an agreement this week. Dan?
John Roberts reporting live from the White House. Another of the Western correspondents in Kabul, Afghanistan tonight, is an eyewitness to the triumphal entry into the city by the Northern Alliance. Andrew Wilson of Britain's Sky News. I asked him about conditions in the streets of the capital now.
Well, it's been a fairly slick operation so far, I have to say. They've trained up police, special police, which moved immediately to all the police stations around the city, and a militia as well, which sit on the street corners. They're heavily armed, keeping an eye on the local population, looking out for looters, and maintaining a sense of calm and law and order in the city.
Is the city calm tonight?
It is indeed calm tonight, and I think that's a testimony to how the Northern Alliance planned their occupation. And I think there's every danger that individuals let loose with weapons in the streets of a city like Kabul could turn the situation very nasty in a matter of hours. And I think it was a wise decision by the Northern Alliance to keep the bulk of their troops outside the city while they established calm. You might see behind me the bright lights of Kabul. Well, that's the first time the citizens of Kabul have had power on at this time of night in about 3 or 4 weeks.
I know how difficult it must be to tell, but do you have any sense of whether those who were trying to defend Kabul in the last hours were Afghanistan's own, or were they people from Pakistan and Arab countries who were part of not necessarily a mercenary force, but an outside force in defense?
Dan, not only in the advance yesterday to the gates of Kabul when the push forward happened, but also this morning when we came into the streets, I personally came across a few prisoners that had been taken by the Northern Alliance. All those I spoke to were from Pakistan, but also I believe there were some Arabs amongst the prisoners. I think it's fair to say that a significant number of the Taliban's defense force were made up of Arabs and Pakistani mercenaries.
Andrew Wilson in Kabul, thanks. Today's other major story is the investigation into the crash of American Airlines Flight 587 here in New York City. It is not yet known whether it was an accident or sabotage. CBS's Bob Orr has new information this evening about the evidence collected so far and what it does and does not show.
A preliminary inspection of the engines from American Airlines Flight 587 has revealed no sign of an in-flight engine explosion or of a catastrophic failure capable of tearing the jetliner apart. And the plane's cockpit voice recorder revealed no sounds loud enough to indicate either the explosion of an engine or a bomb. But the tape did capture 2 rattling noises, consistent with aircraft vibrations shortly after takeoff. The pilots discussed whether the rattles occurred when their plane flew through the wake of a larger Boeing 747 that had taken off just in front of them. In response, the pilots added power to the engines, and 19 seconds later, the plane crashed. But something caused the Airbus A300 to begin breaking up in the air. Both engines detached from the wings before the plane hit the ground, falling in separate spots several blocks away from the primary crash scene. And a half-mile from there, the jet's large vertical tail fin came down, intact and virtually unscratched in Jamaica Bay. It's that discovery that has stunned investigators, who now must consider the possibility that the destruction of the plane began in the back. The vertical tail is attached to the top of the fuselage with a series of large fittings or bolts. Engineers say it would likely take a wholesale structural failure, a sudden sideways movement of the jet, sabotage, or an explosive force to break off the fin. There is no known precedent. But veteran crash investigators say if the vertical stabilizer was the first failure on Flight 587, the aircraft may have been rocked by vibrations severe enough to knock the engines off the wings. Definitive clues could come from the flight data recorder, the plane's second black box recovered late today from the wreckage and flown to the NTSB's lab in Washington. The box should be able to finally rule in or out an engine problem and may be able to pin down the critical question of what went wrong first on Flight 587. Investigators say they can't understand how the plane broke up so quickly if no explosion was involved. The jet only flew for about 2 minutes to an altitude of 2,800 feet. And investigators say it did not fall with the kind of speed normally needed for large parts to break off. Dan?
Bob Orr. Up next here on the CBS Evening News, Eye on America, on the toll the crash has taken on 2 New York communities. 260 people on American Airlines Flight 587 when it crashed in New York. Many were Dominicans heading home to the Dominican Republic, and their names were put on display today at the Santo Domingo airport, where loved ones gathered to await information and share their grief. They grieve in New York as well, in Dominican neighborhoods, and in the community where the plane went down. CBS's Lee Cowan reports tonight's Eye on America.
From fence post to fence post across a dozen backyards, it's hand-to-hand searching for evidence and clues buried in wreckage and rubble. Still smoldering debris sits soaking in jet fuel, with pieces of the plane even larger than the homes. The cleanup could take weeks, the emotional recovery even longer, especially for the neighbors who arrived here first.
I remember seeing him still in the main body of the fuselage, and I remember seeing people still in the seats, you know, and bodies still where they hit, and it's kind of gruesome to see.
And it was then that two hard-hit and tight-knit neighborhoods began to unravel together. At least 69 of the passengers on board the doomed flight were from the Dominican Republic. Many of their families lived in this predominantly Dominican neighborhood in Manhattan. One of them was Felix Sanchez, a longtime New Yorker who thought he'd made it through the worst disaster of his life.
The day of the World Trade Center accident, Felix was on an assignment outside the building, and he escaped that tragedy, only to be hit by this one.
A sailor from the very same neighborhood had just returned on Saturday aboard the USS Enterprise. Ruben Rodriguez survived a tour overseas. He did not survive the trip home.
He feels his brother is a hero, quite frankly, that he served this country militarily.
Two neighborhoods, one city. Terrible ironies in a terrible time.
We have two beautiful communities in New York City that don't deserve this kind of grief. But the thing about them, you have to understand, these are two very strong communities with very strong religious faith.
A faith that in both communities has been tested more than once. Kevin Lunny was on his way to a funeral for a fellow firefighter killed in the World Trade Center when duty called again.
Since September 11th, anywhere you go, you ask, is your family okay? Because you don't know, because everybody in the city has been touched one way or another by this, and now it starts all over again.
Tonight, they are two neighborhoods adjusting to life suddenly so drastically different in a city still struggling to heal. In Bell Harbor, New York, this is Lee Cowan for Eye on America.
It was a history-making day for the Roman Catholic Church in the United States. 53-year-old Bishop Wilton Gregory of Belleville, Illinois, was elected the first African-American president of the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. Bishop Gregory has often said racism is a sin that the church must do more to address. A Pentagon source tells CBS News tonight he does not believe a U.S. plane deliberately struck the office of the Arab television network Al Jazeera in the Afghan capital of Kabul. But he says it might have happened by accident. The office was heavily damaged by something early today, and Al Jazeera now describes it as an American missile whose warhead they say failed to explode. Without in any way downplaying the importance of the ongoing success of the American-backed anti-Taliban forces in Afghanistan, it is important to keep in mind that this war is far from won. And as CBS's Byron Pitts reports tonight from the city of Taliban, even behind United Front lines, Afghanistan remains a very dangerous place.
Tonight, the United Front is in control of much of Afghanistan. But be clear, they have not yet conquered it. There are still bands of Taliban soldiers roaming in central and northern Afghanistan. We passed some of their positions during our journey from Hocha-Bahauddin here to the United Front stronghold of Taliban. It's a 4-hour trip, but it took us nearly 8 hours, in part because of the landmines left behind by the Taliban that litter the roadway. It's estimated there's still close to 70,000 landmines in northern Afghanistan alone. Add to that the bandits, the bad men on both sides, taking advantage of these dangerous times. During our trip, our 19-year-old driver turned to me and asked, "Do you have a gun? Do any of you have a gun?" I smiled and said no. He turned back, rolled his eyes and said, "Then we must drive faster." Tonight, the United Front has the momentum, but this is far from over. In the 1980s, the Russians took control of all the major cities in Afghanistan and lost nearly 15,000 soldiers trying to defend them. In Afghanistan, wars are not won, they're endured. Byron Pitts, CBS News, Taliban, Afghanistan.
And there's more CBS News straight ahead, so stay here with us. In Washington, there were memorial services this day for two casualties of war. Friends, family, and federal officials honored two fallen postal workers, 47-year-old Joseph Cursine and Thomas Morris, who was 55. They worked side by side and died a day apart of anthrax they contracted on the job. And in an act of charity and debt of history, Columbia, South Carolina students have raised money to replace a New York City fire truck destroyed at the World Trade Center. Back in 1867, after the Civil War, New York firefighters provided Columbia's overworked bucket brigade with a new horse-drawn fire truck. Columbia, South Carolina vowed it would always remember, and it did. And that's part of our world tonight. Dan Rather inviting you to join us again tomorrow for the Hard News CBS Evening News. Good night.
For news 24 hours a day, CBS.com on the internet and on our interactive partner, America Online, at keyword CBS News.
Afghanistan's women, do they have any hope for a better future? Tomorrow. Experience CBS News.
Volunteer News at 7 is